Arlis Perry had always stood out not for seeking attention, but for the quiet strength of her convictions. She was raised in Bismarck, North Dakota, a place where faith was not just a Sunday tradition, but the foundation of daily life. Her Lutheran upbringing instilled in her a strong moral compass, a belief that good and evil were real forces at play in the world. At just 19 years old, Arlis had recently married her high school sweetheart, Bruce Perry, a bright young man with a promising future. When Bruce was accepted to Stanford University, it was an exciting opportunity, but it also meant uprooting their lives and moving nearly 1,500 miles away to California. To most, it would have been an adventure, but for Arlis, something about California felt off. She had confided in friends that people there seemed different, not just in lifestyle, but in a way she couldn't quite put into words. The culture was unfamiliar, colder, less rooted in the values she had grown up with. And then there were the disturbing encounters. Arlis had been deeply troubled by interactions with strangers who seemed almost hostile toward her faith. Whether it was passing remarks or a sense of unease she couldn't shake, she began to feel like she didn't belong. Yet she remained devoted. She prayed often, attended church regularly, and even sought to spread her faith in a place where she felt it was needed. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her devotion would soon place her at the center of one of Stanford's most chilling murder cases. The night of October 12, 1974, started like any other. Arlis and Bruce were in their campus dorm room at Stanford, settling in for the evening. A minor disagreement arose, something trivial about car maintenance. It wasn't a heated argument, just one of those small marital spats that come and go. But for some reason, Arlis didn't want to stay in the room. Maybe she needed fresh air. Maybe she just needed a moment alone with God. She told Bruce she was going to Stanford Memorial Church, the grand Gothic cathedral on campus where she often went to pray. Bruce didn't object. She had done this before, after all. So, at 11:30 p.m., she stepped out of their dormitory and into the cool night air. She was alone. Bruce assumed she would be back soon. But the night wore on. Minutes turned into an hour, then two. And as the early morning hours crept in, a terrible feeling settled over him. Arlis wasn't coming home, and she never would. The next morning, before sunrise, Stephen Crawford made his usual rounds. It was around 5:45 am when he arrived at Stanford Memorial Church, keys jingling in his hand. By all accounts, it should have been just another quiet morning. He unlocked the heavy doors and stepped inside. Immediately, something felt off. The air was different, still heavy, wrong. Crawford moved deeper into the silent church, the wooden floor creaking beneath his feet. He walked past the long rows of pews, the scent of candle wax still lingering in the air. And then he saw something. At first, it didn't make sense. In the left transept, just beyond the altar, something lay sprawled between the pews. His breath caught in his throat. As he stepped closer, his stomach lurched. It was a woman's body, and she had been brutally, ritualistically murdered. The air inside Stanford Memorial Church was thick with the scent of burned-out candles and old wood, but beneath it, something darker lingered, something that made even the most seasoned investigators shudder. Arlis Perry lay on her back, sprawled between the pews. Her body had been positioned deliberately, as if placed there with careful, intentional precision. She was partially undressed, her blouse torn open, her jeans removed, but they weren't discarded in a panic. They had been folded neatly beside her, an unsettling contrast to the brutality of the scene. A 20-inch altar candle had been forced into her body, violating her in a way that suggested this was more than just murder, it was a desecration. A second candle unlit but ominous, had been placed across her chest, almost like a twisted offering. At first glance, the scene looked ritualistic. The way her body was displayed, the objects used, the eerie stillness of it all, it felt like a statement. Whoever had done this wasn't just killing. They were sending a message. Within the hour, the church was swarming with detectives and forensic experts. Even the most hardened investigators were shaken by the brutality of what they saw. The first and most puzzling detail: there was no sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no damaged doors, no signs that anyone had forced their way in or out. The only people with access to the church overnight were security personnel. The doors had been locked when the church was closed, which meant the killer had either hidden inside before the church was locked up, or Arlis had let them in. The crime scene was carefully documented. Blood was found only near her body, indicating she had been murdered right there in that spot. Semen samples were collected, an invaluable clue, but in 1974, forensic science was nowhere near what it is today. Without modern DNA analysis, the sample was useless. Then there were the symbols. Strange, etched markings were found near the pews, carved into the wood. Some said they resembled Masonic symbols. Others whispered about occult markings. One thing was clear: this wasn't random. It was deliberate. And the more police looked into Arlis's murder, the stranger the case became. The crime scene inside Stanford Memorial Church was already nightmarish, but what investigators found next only deepened the mystery. Carved into one of the wooden pews near Arlis Perry's body were strange symbols, jagged, almost ritualistic in nature. No one could immediately decipher their meaning. Some believed they resembled Masonic imagery, pointing to symbols long associated with secret societies and hidden knowledge. Others saw something darker: markings that bore a resemblance to those used in occult rituals. California in the 1970s was a breeding ground for fringe movements and cult activity, groups that operated in the shadows, blurring the lines between philosophy, religion, and something much more sinister. Had Arlis stumbled into something she wasn't supposed to see? Just months before her death, she had spoken openly about wanting to convert members of Satanic cults to Christianity, a mission she saw as an extension of her faith. Some of her friends later recalled that she had seemed particularly troubled by a group she had encountered in California, people who had been hostile toward her beliefs. Was it possible that Arlis had been targeted for her faith? Or had she unknowingly walked into the center of something far more terrifying? When details of the crime scene leaked, the whispers began. Whispers of ritual sacrifice. Whispers of satanic cults operating in the shadows. The murder of Arlis Perry was brutal, but it didn't feel random, and the public wanted answers. One theory pointed to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, an infamous cult that had been active in California. The group had long been rumored to be involved in ritual killings, and some believed they had ties to Charles Manson and his followers. The gruesome, staged nature of Arlis's murder, along with the symbols, seemed to fit their profile. Then there was another theory, one that suggested an even larger, more insidious network could be involved. Some believed the Freemasons had played a role in her murder. The Masonic-like symbols found near her body raised questions about whether her death was part of an elaborate ritual, a sacrifice carried out by a powerful hidden group. But the strangest link came from a notorious serial killer sitting in a prison cell thousands of miles away. A man known as Son of Sam. And what he had to say about the case would shock investigators to their core. By the late 1970s, the name David Berkowitz had become synonymous with terror. The son of Sam, as the press called him, had brutally murdered 6 people in a series of chilling, seemingly random shootings in New York City. His arrest in 1977 should have marked the end of his reign of terror. But in prison, Berkowitz started talking, and what he revealed was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. He claimed that he hadn't acted alone. He insisted that the Son of Sam murders were part of a much larger, organized satanic cult, a network that spanned coast to coast, operating in secrecy, using ritual killings to gain power and influence. At first, police dismissed his claims as the ravings of a madman, but then Berkowitz started naming specific cases. In a series of letters to journalist Maury Terry, Berkowitz hinted that the cult he had been involved with was responsible for other murders killings that had been staged to look like random acts of violence but were in reality ritual sacrifices. One of the cases he specifically mentioned, the murder of Arlis Perry. He described it as a textbook cult killing carried out by individuals with connections to satanic organizations that had been operating in California at the time. The details he provided about the crime scene were eerily accurate details that hadn't been released to the public. Could it be true? Had Arlis walked into something much bigger than anyone realized? Or was Berkowitz just playing mind games, feeding conspiracy theories from behind bars? Either way, his claims would forever link Arlis Perry's death to something far darker than anyone had initially suspected. While investigators chased down leads about cults and secret societies, they had to consider another possibility, one that was much closer to home. What if Bruce Perry had something to do with his wife's murder? It was standard procedure. Most murders are committed by someone close to the victim. And while Bruce had been the one to raise the alarm, that didn't completely clear him. Had their small argument that night escalated into something worse? Had Arlis never made it to the church at all? Detectives scrutinized Bruce's alibi, checking and rechecking his timeline. But no matter how hard they looked, they couldn't poke holes in it. Bruce had been in their dorm room all night. Multiple witnesses had seen him, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. In the end, the police ruled him out as a suspect. But without any other strong leads, the case stalled. And as the years passed, the mystery of Arlis Perry's murder only deepened. For more than 4 decades, the murder of Arlis Perry remained one of the most chilling unsolved cases in California. Theories swirled: cult activity, a lone psychopath, an inside job, but no matter how many investigators tried to crack the case, no suspect ever stuck. Every lead seemed to fade into darkness. The semen sample collected at the crime scene had the potential to identify the killer, but in 1974, DNA technology was still in its infancy. Without a viable way to match the evidence, it was filed away, waiting for a future where science could uncover the truth. Over the years, detectives revisited the case multiple times. They questioned old suspects, scoured cult connections, and even re-examined the symbols found near Arlis's body, but nothing led them closer to an answer. For decades, it seemed as if Arlis's killer had vanished into thin air. Until investigators decided to take another look. And this time, they had the power of modern DNA technology on their side. It was 2018 when police ran the old DNA sample through an advanced forensic database. What they found changed everything. The DNA was a match. And it wasn't from some mysterious cult member. It belonged to Stephen Crawford, the same campus security guard who had discovered Arlis's body 44 years earlier. The revelation was staggering. Crawford had been there that night. He had claimed he locked up the church. He had acted like a witness, but all along he had been hiding a horrifying secret. Police wasted no time. They moved quickly to arrest Crawford at his home in California. But before they could take him into custody, he pulled out a gun. Officers shouted for him to stop, but before they could reach him, Crawford pulled the trigger. In an instant, he was dead. With one gunshot, he silenced himself forever. And just like that, the truth about what really happened that night died with him. With Stephen Crawford's death, the murder of Arlis Perry was officially closed. At least that's what the police wanted to believe. His DNA had been found at the crime scene. He had been on duty that night. He was the last known person to see Arlis alive. And when police came to arrest him, instead of answering for his crimes, he chose to end his own life. In the eyes of the law, it was an open and shut case. But for those who had followed the investigation for decades, something still didn't add up. Had Crawford really acted alone? Or had Arlis stumbled into something far more sinister, something that Crawford was a part of but didn't orchestrate? There were too many unanswered questions. Why had her murder been staged so deliberately? Why the Masonic-like symbols near her body? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, was Crawford a lone predator, or was he silenced before he could reveal something bigger? Because when investigators searched Crawford's home after his death, they found something disturbing. Something that suggested Arlis Perry's murder was not as simple as it seemed. When police entered Crawford's residence, they expected to find a few personal items, maybe some old security uniforms, but nothing unusual. Instead, they found papers, books, and documents that hinted at something far more chilling. Inside his home were references to secret societies, notes on occult rituals, and symbols eerily similar to the markings found at the crime scene. There were books on Satanism, drawings of ritualistic symbols, and references to elite circles at Stanford University people Crawford should have had no connection to. Had Arlis's murder been a ritual killing after all? And if so, was Crawford the mastermind? Or had he been just a pawn? There was one theory that investigators could never fully disprove, that Crawford didn't act alone that night. The way Arlis's body was posed, the symbols, the ritualistic overtones, it was too elaborate, too staged to be the work of a random opportunistic killer. Had Crawford been part of a larger group, perhaps one that had been operating in the shadows of Stanford University for years? Or was it possible that he was just an obsessive, disturbed man, someone who had developed a fixation on Arlis and acted on his own twisted desires? Some believe that Crawford's suicide was more than just an act of guilt. Some believe that he was silenced, that someone or something bigger didn't want him to talk. Even though the case was officially closed, it left behind more questions than answers. And to this day, there are those who believe that Arlis Perry's murder was never truly solved. The Stanford Memorial Church is meant to be a place of worship, of peace, a sanctuary where prayers rise to the heavens, where faith provides comfort. But for those who know what happened there, it is a place of darkness. Decades have passed since Arlis Perry was murdered inside its walls, but the chilling weight of her death has never truly lifted. Visitors, especially those who know the history, speak of an uneasy presence in the church. Some claim that in the left transept, the very place where her body was found, the air feels different, colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves remember. Some say they have heard whispers in the empty pews. Others have reported the feeling of being watched. And then there are the unexplained occurrences, candles extinguishing on their own, the occasional flicker of shadows where there should be none. Is it just superstition? Or is it possible that something from that night still lingers? Despite Crawford's suicide, despite the DNA evidence that closed the case, not everyone is convinced that Arlis Perry's murder was as simple as the police claim. Some believe it was a perfect crime disguised as an act of random violence, but with a much deeper purpose. Others believe that the truth was buried with Crawford, that in the end, he took his secrets to the grave. But one question continues to haunt those who look into this case. Arlis Perry believed in fighting darkness with light. She was a woman of deep faith, someone who sought to convert others, to save them from paths she believed led to evil. Had she stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see? Did she walk into that church that night and discover a secret so dangerous that it cost her life? Or was her murder simply the work of a disturbed man, an act of random cruelty disguised as something more? The official investigation is closed. The case is solved on paper. But something about it still feels unfinished. Because if there's one thing true crime teaches us, it's that truth doesn't always come to light. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there still knows more. Did Stephen Crawford act alone, or was he protecting something larger? Why was Arlis's murder staged so deliberately with ritualistic elements? And most chilling of all, what did she see inside that church that sealed her fate? Some questions are never meant to be answered, but the truth, the real truth, may still be out there.